Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Friends, welcome back to the last gathering of the DeNicola Center's 2021 Winter Conference, We Belong to Each Other. These 3 days online together have truly sped by for me, but I have been so gratified to see so many friends, old and new, logging on for these great conversations. It's a testament to the connections and friendships fostered through so many fall conference gatherings over the years that even our distance and time apart can't dampen that great communal spirit that is such a hallmark of our gatherings every year. If anything, these 3 days have reminded me of how wonderful our time together at the annual fall conference truly is, and it makes me impatient for the time when we can all be together again. As Anna Moreland said last night, discussing panels over dinner and sharing a glass of wine together at McKenna Hall. So in that spirit, and because the third night of our conference is traditionally a more relaxed conversation, I'd invite you all to join us with a glass of your choice around our shared virtual table for what I know will be a wonderful evening. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, let me quickly mention two brief housekeeping notes. First, as always, you can submit questions for our guest via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation. Secondly, we have a gift for participants in tonight's webinar, Dana Gioia's latest book, Studying with Miss Bishop. It was released earlier this week from Paul Dry Books, and we're delighted to have a limited number of copies available to share with our guests this evening. Participants will receive an email in the coming days with further instructions on how they can request a free copy of the book. And now, let me introduce tonight's guest. Dana Gioia is an internationally acclaimed poet and author who served as the California Poet Laureate from 2015 to 2018 and is chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2009. The first person in his family to attend college, Gioia received a BA and MBA from Stanford University and a Master's of Arts from Harvard in Comparative Literature. For 15 years, he worked as a businessman before quitting at 41 to become a full-time writer. Gioia has published 5 full-length collections of verse, most recently 99 Poems, New and Selected in 2016, which won the Poets Prize as the best new book of the year. His third collection, Interrogations at Noon, published in 2001, was awarded the American Book Award. Gioia is best known as a central figure in the revival of rhyme, meter, and narrative in contemporary poetry. Critic William Oxley has called Gioia, quote, probably the most exquisite poet writing in English today. Gioia has also published 4 books of essays and edited or co-edited 24 best-selling literary anthologies, including An Introduction to Poetry and Best American Poetry 2018. His essays and memoirs have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Hudson Review, and BBC Radio. In addition to the American Book Award and Poets Prize, Gioia has won many awards, including the Laetare Medal from the University of Notre Dame in 2010, the Presidential Citizens Medal, the Aiken-Taylor Award in Modern Poetry, and the Walt Whitman Champion of Literacy Prize. Friends, please join me in welcoming Dana Gioia.
Thank you, Carter. Let me begin simply by saying what joy I feel being in this company tonight. What joy to share your presence. All of us have been locked down for the better part of a year, and we have been cut off from friends, family, workmates. We've also been cut off from all the casual social contacts that enrich our daily lives. And worse yet, we've been largely cut off, from Mass and worship in churches. But tonight, we actually are together in this spectral plane of digital technology. And together, several hundred strong, we form a modestly great cloud of witnesses. And this is something to celebrate. The phrase cloud of witnesses reminded me of a verse elsewhere in St. Paul's epistle of the Hebrews, in which he says, "Let us consider how we may spur one another towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another." So, we are meeting together. Now, one of the books that has guided my life, and I mean this virtually on a daily basis, has been St. Augustine's City of God. That inexhaustible meditation on what it means to be a Christian in the world. In this book, Augustine posits the existence of the city of God, which he contrasts to the city that we all recognize, the city of man. We spend our lives day by day in the city of mind, which is guided by wealth and power, position and privilege. But Augustine declared that there was another invisible city, which coexisted everywhere with the city of man. And no matter where we were and what troubles prevailed, we could find comfort and refuge in this invisible and eternal community, which was open to all those who elect to live by the laws of God. So I want to say that I consider tonight a neighborhood meeting in the city of God. And I want to give a great whoop of joy because I'm here with you. Now, Carter has introduced me eloquently and amply, but I would offer a shorter introduction for myself. I'm a sinner, I'm a pilgrim, and worst of all, I'm a poet. I am not a theologian. I am just a faithful pew-level Catholic, and I don't claim any special insights. But as an observant Catholic, I've observed a lot of things about the world and what Catholic cultural life has become. Now, I think in every case, these are things that you have probably all observed for yourself, but let me articulate them. We live in a secular world in which public and cultural acknowledgement of our Christianity is being erased. For those of us who are teachers or writers or artists, this erasure has been a great impoverishment, not just of our Christian identity, but our entire cultural heritage. And I think every Catholic or Christian experiences a sense of loss, of impoverishment in their own way. Now, the question, this is something that Catholics talk a lot about. In fact, I saw a remarkable play on the internet a few weeks ago, which is called Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which takes place at a Catholic college in Wyoming. And people talk about what can we do in response to this impoverishment, this erasure of Christianity? And I think there's at least three things that people tend to do. They're all legitimate, but I do have a preference. The first is we can put our heads down and hide from the world. We can try to be invisible, as invisible as the divine city that we want to live in, and live as Christians in a faithful but private way. I know a great many people who have made this their choice. Or we can become culture warriors. We can fight the secular world. We can try to regain some of the territory that we've lost. In fact, Carter and I, before this public session began, was talking about a couple of people that we know who have taken this stance. And I understand the impulse to fight for our tradition. But I worry that fighting is the wrong posture to have versus the world, versus the public world. When we fight, we gradually come to resemble the enemies that we combat. And combat scars and disfigures our spirit. So I tend to favor a third option, which is to build and strengthen our own community. I believe the best, not the only, but the best response is to join hands with our fellow Catholics and Christians and to build exemplary communities of shared values. Now, of course, we have the large common community that we share, the Catholic Church, but frankly, the Catholic Church now encompasses 1 billion people. And so we have to have a more local sense, a more individual sense of our Catholic communities. And so I think that we need to start thinking of smaller and more specialized communities that are units of the universal church. And let me just give you one example that I've been involved with, which is a kind of artistic community that's coming out of the church. As a writer, and I bet there are a lot of people that are here this evening that know exactly what I'm talking about. As a writer, I had noticed for years how isolated, lonely, and marginal a lot of Catholic writers and teachers and artists felt. They might be the only believer on their faculty. They might be the only artist in their community, who was a Catholic or a Christian. So in 2015, when I was teaching at the University of Southern California, I decided to create a free national conference for Catholic writers. Now, I want to make it clear, I had no budget, I had no staff, I had no approval from the university, but I did talk to Father Jim Heft at the Center for Advanced Catholic Studies, which had a staff of 2 people, and we decided to do it. And he asked me how I was going to get the money, and I said, I believe in divine providence, which is that I believed that if the idea were good enough, others would join us and support. Almost immediately, Angela O'Donnell at Fordham called me up and said she wanted to be part of it, and she would try to, offer some financial and some logistical support. Soon Paul Contino and Mary Mullins at Pepperdine, Caleb Spencer and the late Brett Foster, at Azusa Pacific, and a number of other people stepped forward. If you invite people to the right occasion, they want to come. They want to make themselves useful. And so we put on a conference which was entirely free, including free meals to anybody who showed up. And we had faculty that included Tobias Wolff, Julia Alvarez, Ron Hansen, Angela O'Donnell, Paul Mariani, James Matthew Wilson, Peggy Ellsberg, and the great late historian Kevin Starr. We had 250 writers and several hundred high school kids who attended the sessions. 2 years later, Angela O'Donnell created a second conference at Fordham. She had 60 faculty and speakers with over 400 writers and editors attending. Then in 2019 at Loyola Chicago, Michael Murphy hosted an even larger conference with 700 writers, publishers, and editors attending. By the time we got to New York, and certainly by the time we got to Chicago, everyone who was there was happy because they had found a place where things would happen that were not happening anywhere else in their life, and that they understood that we had called into being a powerful national Catholic community of writers, publishers, editors, teachers, and artists. We had gone from isolation to community. We had met each other in conversation and discovery, and we brought together so many extraordinary people that as a result, from the USC conference on, it began to foster other enterprises, magazines, reading groups, radio shows, conferences, websites, film projects, drama groups. We gained strength and clarity by being together. And so will everyone here tonight, everyone who has participated today, gain not only strength, but clarity from gathering together. Let us consider how we may spur one another towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, but encourage one another. Now, the Gospels tell us that great is the harvest, but the workers are few. Now, that's generally true, but I would suggest it's not true tonight. We have several hundred people here today. There's been over 1,000 strong in the course of this day. There have been enough people present in this Notre Dame conference to change our culture. We have enough talent, energy, focus, and expertise that if we come together, we can make astonishing things happen for our culture, for our faith, for ourselves, and for our community. So I'll simply ask, why should we wait? Now, I wanted to read just 5 poems. I would be tempted to read 25 poems, but I think fewer poems are better than lots of poems. So I'm going to start with the earliest poem that I published that I still, recognize as my own. It's the first poem in my collection, 99 poems. And I'm going to end with the most recent poem that I've published. And we'll start with a poem which is called The Burning Ladder. When I was in my 20s, I was rereading Genesis, and I was surprised when I reread the incident of Jacob in the desert, seeing the vision of Jacob's ladder, because I had forgotten that he never climbs it. He never goes anywhere. He just sees it. And so I wrote a poem, which is a kind of paraphrase with commentary of this famous passage in Genesis, the burning ladder. Jacob never climbed the ladder burning in his dreams. Sleep pressed him like a stone in the dust, and when he should have risen like a flame to join that choir, he was sick of traveling and closed his eyes to the seraphim ascending, unconscious of the impossible distances between their steps. Missed them mount the brilliant ladder, slowly disappearing into the scattered light between the stars, and slept through it all, a stone upon a stone pillow, shivering, gravity always greater than desire. And now I'm going to read a poem that is a prayer. It's a particular kind of prayer. You'll recognize what it is. It is 14 lines long, and every line begins with the same word. Prayer at winter solstice. Blessed is the road that keeps us homeless. Blessed is the mountain that blocks our way. Blessed are hunger and thirst, loneliness and all forms of desire. Blessed is the labor that exhausts us without end. Blessed are the night and the darkness that blinds us. Blessed is the cold that teaches us to feel. Blessed are the cat, the child, the cricket, and the crow. Blessed is the hawk devouring the hare. Blessed are the saint and the sinner who redeem each other. Blessed are the dead, calm in their perfection. Blessed is the pain that humbles us. Blessed is the distance that bars our joy. Blessed is this shortest day that makes us long for light. Blessed is the love that in the losing we discover. That, I think, is probably the most Catholic poem that I've ever written, because it articulates the necessity of suffering in terms to feel the need for redemption, to feel the need for grace. 3 more poems. This next one is a poem spoken by a statue, and it's a particular kind of statue, which I usually have to describe to people, but tonight I can actually reach for one. This is a santo. These are wooden hand-carved statues that are carved in Mexico and Latin America. People tend to have them in their homes for a home altar, but larger ones, much more crudely carved than this one, which is by a contemporary Los Angeles Mexican folk artist, that would be in very poor churches that couldn't afford, more expensive artwork. So this is spoken by a santo. It's a santo of an angel that's in a museum. And this santo has been damaged in the Mexican Revolution, which when the troops came and the Catholic Church was declared illegal, the churches were vandalized and all the religious images destroyed. It is somehow, was damaged but not destroyed. And it's spoken in a museum by this statue. It's called The Angel with the Broken Wing. I am the angel with the broken wing, the one large statue in this quiet room. The staff finds me too fierce, and so they shut faith's ardor in this air-conditioned tomb. The docents praise my elegant design above the chatter of the gallery. Perhaps I am a masterpiece of sorts, a perfect emblem of futility. Mendoza carved me for a country church. His name's forgotten now, except by me. I stood beside a gilded altar where the hopeless offered God their misery. I heard their women whispering at my feet, prayers for the lost, the dying, and the dead. Their candles stretched my shadows up the wall, and I became the hunger that they fed. I lost my left wing in the revolution. Even a saint can savor irony. When troops were sent to vandalize the chapel, they hit me once, almost apologetically, for even the godless feel something in a church, a twinge of hope, fear, who knows what it is, a trembling unaccounted by their laws, an ancient memory that they can't dismiss. There is so much I must tell God. The howling of the damned can't reach that high, but I sit here like a dead thing nailed to a perch, a crippled saint against a painted sky. That's my commentary on what happens to art when it's taken from a sacred context and made into a merely aesthetic object. Now, two more poems, and this one is a love poem. There are thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps millions of love poems. There seem to be very few good love poems in praise of the love of in marriage. And so I wrote my wife this poem. It's about this wonderful thing that happens when you've been married to someone for a long time. The two of you create a kind of private language. You can speak so intimately that this private language is probably the most intimate form of communication you'll ever have with another person. But it's also very fragile. If one of you dies or one of you leaves the relationship, there is no one else with whom you speak this language. It reminded me of these California Indian languages, which now have only one or two native speakers. And when that person dies, the language dies, the songs, the dances, the memory of the people die. And so I use that as a kind of metaphor to discuss my love for my wife. It's called Marriage of Many Years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. You are a language I have learned by heart. This intimate patois will vanish with us. Does it matter? Our tribal chants, our dances round the fire performed the sorcery we most required. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in solemn secrecy. What must be lost was never lost on us. And then I want to end with a poem that came out in the December issue of First Things. And I don't know if this poem will require explanation or not, but one of the reasons that I chose it is that Archbishop Gomez was one of your speakers, my Archbishop in Los Angeles, which is the largest Spanish-speaking center in the United States. And in fact, Los Angeles, I think, is the fourth largest Spanish-speaking city in the world. The history of California is Latin and Catholic. And we are losing that historical, conscious right now in terms of the secularization of American culture. So this is a poem that's about the origins of Los Angeles. It was founded by a group of people called Los Pobladores. Now, what Los Pobladores means is simply the people that live there, the residents. But there was this ragtag group of people, all of whom were mixed race, interestingly. There were 44 of them who came and created this little town, this pueblo in Los Angeles. And there was a tiny river running through it. And so they named the river and the city after Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels, Nuestra Señora, Reina de los Ángeles. And the shortened version of that title is still the name of the city, the Angels, de Los Angeles. So this begins with the odd but symbolic founding of this city by these people that no one else wanted, these people that were really just the dross of the Spanish Empire, and it brings it up to the present moment. It's called Psalm to Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Let us sing our city a new song, a song that remembers its name and its founders, Los Pobladores, the forgotten 44 who built their pueblo beside a small river. They named the river for the Queen of the Angels, Nuestra Señora, Reina de los Ángeles. Poor, they were forced to the margins of empire, dark, dispossessed, not one couple pure. Let us praise the marriages and matings that created us, desire swifter than democracy in merging the races, Spanish, Aztec, African, and Anglo, forbidden matches made holy by children. I praise myself, a mutt of mestizo and mezzogiorno, the seed of exiles and violent men, disfigured by the burdens they shouldered to survive, broken or bent, their boast was their suffering. I praise my ancestors, the unkillable poor, the few who escaped disease or despair, the restless, the hungry, the stubborn, the scarred. Let us praise the dignity of their destitution. Let us praise their mother, Nuestra Señora, the lost guardian who watches them still from murals and medals, statues, tattoos. She has not abandoned her divided pueblo. She has been homeless with a hungry child, a refugee fleeing a brutal warlord, a mother. She held her murdered son. Her crown is jeweled with 7 sorrows. Pray for the city that lost its name. Pray for the people too humble for progress. Pray for the flesh that pays for the prophet. Pray for the angels kept from their queen. Pray in the hour of our death each day, in the southern sun of this desecrated city. Pray for us, Mother of the mixed and misbegotten, beside our dry river and the tents of the outcast poor. Thank you for letting me share those poems with you. And now, let's converse.
Wow, it's hard to speak after hearing those poems, Dana. I mean, they were extraordinarily beautiful and powerful. The angels kept from their queen. That's really something. Do people in Los Angeles know that their city is named for the Blessed Mother?
Not many. So there's a hospital called the Queen of the Angels Hospital, but no, it's become the name of. It seems as if our city's been named after a baseball team. I think. But I think Los Angeles, and I say this as a native Angelino, is a city almost without a historical consciousness of its own deep past. I mean, the city is as old as the United States, and it has a very unique history. This was not supposed to be a great city, but it happened, and it happened from the bottom up, built by the poorest people. San Francisco was built by wealth. It was built by the gold rush. But but Los Angeles, was essentially built by the working poor.
That's interesting. And you've lived, and so these poems, they all seem intensely personal. Obviously, the marriage of many years, the Psalm to Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Could you say a little bit to our audience about how you create these poems? I mean, what's the process by which you draw upon these experiences, these things that are deeply important to you? Walk us through how you create, if you would.
Well, I create with blood, toil, sweat, and tears. I mean, my creative process is such a mess that no one should emulate it. I come to write, nothing happens. I straighten my desk, I do this, nothing happens. Finally, the whole morning is gone. I have lunch, I come back, I start to work, nothing happens. Then I begin to hate myself. I begin to feel like I'm kidding myself. Why do I think I'm a writer? If I had any talent, it's been exhausted. And I begin to, it's very Catholic, I think. It's very Catholic guilt. I begin to boil in my Catholic guilt. And then suddenly I hit a certain temperature and I start writing. Now, usually the way a poem happens is that there's been something you've noticed for years, but then suddenly you notice something new and the two things intersect. And when they intersect, sparks fly. And so, when I had lived away from Los Angeles for many years, and 11 years ago, I moved back. I started teaching half the year at USC. And so I was really back where I was from. And I've been, visiting regularly, and, I noticed, these two cities that were simultaneously. One was a very wealthy international city, and the other was a Spanish American city. And I am a product of the Spanish American city. I'm in Sicilian and Mexican, and so, I wanted to write a poem that celebrated the Catholic identity of Los Angeles, the Catholic history of Los Angeles, which people wear on their arms. People have decaled on their cars. They have it muraled on the sides of walls. The poor have not forgotten, where they come from and where they want to go. It's just that the sophisticated parts of the city have chosen to ignore it. And so I wanted to make a poem that went back all the way to the beginning. And I dare say most Angelinos will say, oh yeah, there was this thing, the pobladores. What was it again?
I actually have a tattoo of Our Lady Guadalupe right here. You can't see it right now. That would be that's going to be a password protection part of the webinar. But
if you start trying to count, Our Lady of Guadalupe's, or Our Lady's of Immaculate Conception or anything in Los Angeles, I mean, you're going to go into the 7 digits.
Right. So let's take that poem, the Psalm to Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. So you set out to write a poem to convey I mean, are you writing for an audience? Are you writing to try to educate people? Are you writing to try, are you writing to try to move people with beauty, or are you writing for yourself when you do something like that?
I'm doing all of these things. I mean, when I started writing that poem, I said to myself, nobody, every Catholic poet writes a poem about the Virgin Mary sooner or later. It's kind of, comes with the territory. And they're usually not very good poems because, she's a vast subject to get, to try to encompass in words. And when I was writing it, I said, this poem's not going to work. Nobody's going to publish it. But, there's something here. There's a poem here that I should write. And so, for me, the poem would get longer, then it would get shorter, longer, and get shorter. And I cut out a lot of interesting things, but I realized what it was. I wanted to make ultimately, when I in South Pasadena, where I am right now, when I walk, I see people sleeping in the parks, on the streets, by the side of the freeway. My wife works with the homeless, up north. My own brother, was briefly homeless. And, I wanted to make a line between the people who created what is now the second biggest city in the United States and one of the greatest cities in the world, these poor, disenfranchised people, a straight line from them to the people who are living in tents on the sidewalk, and ask who is redeeming them. And there was only one answer. And so the question was, how do you make that work? And I was very uncomfortable about bringing myself in. I am a mutt of mestizo and mezzogiorno, but I began to understand that I have a lot of violence in my family history. I have a lot of poverty I know that you do too, probably.
Yeah.
Because when you come from the poorest people in society, there's just a lot of stress. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. And so my favorite line in the poem is, let us praise the dignity of their destitution.
Yep.
When I think back of these people who worked enormously hard for very little to, in a sense, earn their place in this new society. And whatever their faults, whatever their violence, whatever their crimes, they deserve praise for that.
Yeah, that I wrote that phrase down as you were reading it. It's extraordinary. I mean, it seems to be connected in deep ways to the prayer at winter solstice, also in terms of the blessedness and praise for other forms of suffering, other forms of destitution. Yeah. Have you shared your work with Pope Francis? Because it seems to me that his special heart for the poor, it would be very moving to him.
I haven't, but he hasn't asked.
Well, you can just send it to him. We can get his email
the
address.
funny thing is that, the hierarchy of the church, I think, has generally lost its connection with artistic culture. And that divorce between the church and artistic culture has crippled the church, and it has crippled culture, because culture doesn't have that transcendent vision which keeps everything from being merely a kind of autobiographical grumble. And the church has become banal in so much of its architecture, its music, its art, and its worship. And, historically, the Catholic Church has had the genius, and there's no other word for it, the genius of finding the most exalted and powerful and evocative forms of human expression and bringing them to the service of God. I think that there's been more people who have been converted or have been redeemed by walking into the architecture of Chartres than were probably by the sermons that were given in Chartres. But when they walked into Chartres or Notre Dame or any of the great cathedrals, they understood that they had entered a place where things might happen to their spirit that were unlikely to happen elsewhere. Questions were likely to be asked that were unlikely to be asked elsewhere. And so I think that the church has largely lost its ability to call forth from us our full intuitive, imaginative, and intellectual responses. And so we have a kind of watered down form of religious experience. Now, I don't mean to be in any sense disrespectful of people I know, such as my wife, who are deeply spiritual, who are involved in daily spiritual disciplines. But how many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people are not?
Now that we 4 years ago, exactly 4 years ago, we had a conference called "You Are Beauty," and the keynote speaker was. I
can see why you didn't invite me.
That's right. We did invite you. Actually, you may remember that.
That wasn't beautiful enough.
I think you had a conflict, but that's okay. But our keynote speaker, our second choice keynote speaker, is a man named Etsuru Soto, who is the chief sculptor for the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and he gave just resonating with what you had just said. He gave an extraordinary talk about his own experience and of moving from being a Japanese atheist, not even marinated in Western culture, a Japanese atheist finishing Gaudi's work brought him to Jesus. It brought him to the faith. And he has a beautiful lecture called "Moved by Beauty" on precisely the themes that you were just.
Our elite artistic culture has consciously rejected the notion of beauty. If there is anything that we need to do to rehabilitate our church, to revitalize our civic culture, it is to renovate the concept of beauty as a positive idea, as a way, in a sense, of expressing truth with the physical particularities, that we experience in the temporal world. So, beauty is, I think, the great issue of the next decade. For any artists, but especially Catholic artists, because it is, I have written above my library 3 words, which, are from Thomas Aquinas, and it's, I'll translate them, but it's beauty, harmony, radiance, which is the notion of that you have pleasing form. You start to see the harmony of all the parts of the form, and out of this vision of incarnate beauty, either in the natural world or the artistic world, Aquinas said, comes radiance. And there's a wonderful phrase of Jacques Maritain, which is the secrets of the mysteries of the secrets of the mysteries of being radiate into the intelligence. And by Maritain, what he means intelligence is not just rational intelligence, but physical, intuitive, imaginative intelligence as the whole human package.
Well, and I'm gonna butcher this, I'm sure, but Pope Benedict famously said, and you'll correct me if I'm getting it wrong, I'm sure you're more familiar with it than I am, that the church will be saved by the lives of the saints, the witness of the saints, and the art of the church, the beauty that the church itself has generated. Now, so that leads me to an obvious question. You were talking earlier, before you shared your beautiful poems with us, you were sort of giving a kind of a prescriptive account of how to grapple with the moment we find ourselves in as Catholics. And it's different in different parts of the country. It's different in California, of course, than it is in Indiana at Notre Dame. So what is the prescription for recovering the importance of beauty with not just among the laity, but also among our church leaders? I mean, what do you have any ideas as to how to proceed to try to revive this focus on beauty and architecture? We have amazing architects here, Duncan Stroik, among them. We had a panel on that earlier.
Notre Dame is a blessed isle in American Catholicism. There is nothing comparable to Notre Dame. And so everyone who is involved with the university, I think really is blessed. But I wrote an article, and I know you've read it, called "The Catholic Writer Today," a number of 7-8 years ago, and it caused a huge international response. And a fellow who was then the Pope's Latin secretary. He had just replaced Reginald Foster. Wrote me and said, "Well, aren't you forgetting the laity? I mean, forgetting the hierarchy." And I said, "I wish I had any confidence that the hierarchy cared." But and let's say even a bishop as wonderful as Bishop Gomez. Bishop Gomez is spending most of his day trying to pay off the mortgages, to raise funds to keep the schools open, to keep the hospitals open, to basically provide for the logistical and material and financial needs of the church. That is such an overwhelming job, plus his pastoral duties. These priests that are saying, going all over the county, saying masses just to accommodate, the faithful. They don't have the time or the energy to deal with these issues, nor for the most part do they have the training. If Catholic culture is going to be revived, it is going to happen through the laity. Whatever clergy wants to join us, whatever hierarchy wants to join us, great. But if we don't do it ourselves, it is not going to happen because it's outside the responsibility and the training of most of our clergy. So my early work, every poem I've written has in some ways been informed by my Catholicism, but I wrote very few explicitly Catholic poems. I was just writing about other things. But when I left the National Endowment for the Arts, which was about 12 years ago, I tried to figure out what was my work now. I mean, I had my private work as an artist, and it struck me in my remaining years. I just turned 70 on Christmas Eve. What should I be doing with my life? And this was when I was turning 60, and it seemed to me that I should try to devote as much of my energy as possible to helping revive American Catholic literary culture. That's why I created the USC conference. But also that takes the place, and I say this to every other well-known writer, we have a responsibility to mentor and help young writers and young artists. It's exhausting, it's time-consuming. It's like being the mother bird with all these little hungry, things. You can never satisfy their needs. But we need to live as Christians, which is to say, we have been commanded is too strong of a word. We have been required to live as a community, not merely a community, but as a family of brothers and sisters, of fathers and children. And I think as artists, we need to adopt that model and to create an artistic community that's exemplary. Now, if you look at most artistic communities, they aren't exemplary. They're competitive, they're destructive, they're full of egotists, they're full of people that are angry and vindictive, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, without losing the toughness of our artistic standards, without losing the passion for intellectual exactitude. We also need to exhibit generosity, love, charity, and to communities. The Roman Empire, Christ, if he'd wanted to, could have raised an army and fought to become king of the Jews. He did not choose that as an example, nor did early Christians do that. Christianity brought down the Roman Empire by setting such a high standard of moral behavior, of love, of spiritual dedication, even unto death, that people were drawn to it. The other thing is that, and this people forget about this, and Paul makes it explicit, this was a religion in which the free and the slave, the master and the slave were equal. This was Christ made a universal call to salvation. And I think in artistic senses, we need to do that too. What I see, and I say this as someone who is chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, what you see in the artistic world are these elaborate, powerful hierarchies of people who control resources, control fame, control grants and things like this, who administer their power, with Caesarian, skill. These are, 10,000 petty Caesars. And we need to not to render our spirit unto these Caesars. And so that's what I would ask. That's why when I created this conference out at USC, it was free. If you showed up, you could come to anything and we would feed you. And we fed you well, because I'm Italian on one half of my family, And so, but I think we need to do that. And there's so many people all over the country that are trying to do this, are starting this. I know that because they write me, or they track me down. And I am glad to hear their good news. They're creating a book group, they're creating a writers group, they're creating a magazine. And we need, to quote, Chairman Mao, to let 1,000 flowers grow, and when we have 1,000 reading series and magazines and presses and writing groups, we will begin to change the culture, not by power, but in a sense by people's desire to emulate what we're doing.
That's very nicely said. Let's turn to some questions from the audience. Mary Frances Myler, who is an undergraduate Soren Fellow of the De Nicholas Center, asks a broad framing question. She is the editor and staff writer for the Notre Dame's Catholic newspaper, the Irish Rover. Here's her question. Poetry can create powerful connections between people, but there seem to be some limitations to that connection. For instance, some people see poetry as inaccessible, and others feel alienated by the complexity of poetry when compared to prose. Could you speak to some of the cultural barriers to connection through poetry? How can poetry belong more fully to everyone?
Well, almost everyone feels some kind of barrier with poetry. And it's because two things. The way we educate people in poetry is bad. And I'll explain that in a second. And the other is that most poems that are published aren't very good. And so if I can redefine the problem is, how do we get more people to respond to good and great poems? I think that our great-grandparents knew, my grandparents, but for the student, her great-grandparents knew more about teaching poetry than people do today. What they would do is they would begin with people reciting and memorizing poems. And so, they would come in, it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom, they would perform them. They would say, they say, Carter, don't worry about understanding this, just do it. Now, you can see actors, how much actors learn about language, about psychology, about everything by just becoming a character. So first they recited and memorized. And then they would say, okay, let's everybody write a poem about, something or other. My first poem in fourth grade, the nun asked us to write a poem about our guardian angel. I wrote, what I thought was a wonderful poem. I hope all copies have been lost. But, you get the experience of writing a poem. So you recite, you memorize, you perform, you imitate. And then once you've had that kind of experience and you're listening to poems, you just listen to poems, then you can analyze. Our educational system has decided that you should begin with analysis. Mm-hmm. Now, what kind of poems are the best to analyze? Difficult poems. Right. And so, I begin with easy poems, with funny poems, with poems that tell stories and things like this, and you'll create a capacity for poetry. My mother was a Mexican-American woman who had very little education, but she loved poetry because she'd had to memorize them in grammar school, as it was then called. Now, some people say, what a barbaric system that was that made these poor innocent children memorize the words of dead men. But these poems were very precious to my mother. And she would recite them all the time. They, and you think about this, you don't have to know 1,000 poems. If you know 5 or 6 great poems by heart, what they become is kind of funnels that connect you into a heightened state of consciousness. They become poems which recognize your capacity to have a heightened state of consciousness. In 19th century America, virtually everybody read poems, heard poems, recited poems. Begin by hearing, reciting, memorizing, try your hand at imitating one or writing one, and only then, get into the intellectual work. Because poetry is a special kind of language which speaks to our total humanity. It addresses our intellect, our emotions, our intuition, our memory, and our physical bodies all at once without asking us to divide them. It's not conceptual language. It's preconceptual language, language in the form of clarifying itself.
Wonderful. Our next question is from friend of the De Nicola Center, Richard Derflinger. He says, can you speak about what makes a literary vision a Catholic one? And what do you see young writers today who have that vision? Or do you see young writers today who have that vision?
Yes, I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. My generation for Catholic letters was pretty much a flop. My generation, we were the first generation. The Catholics historically have been the immigrant poor of the United States. My generation was sort of the first generation of Catholics in which millions of people went to college. And, I saw that most those people, as they went into the artistic fields, decided to shed their Catholicism as a kind of something that wasn't suitable for elite stature. I never did that because I'm just honorary, and and I still identify with with the working class. That's where I'm from. Those are my people. But the good thing is that I see the younger generation, really coming forward, with their Catholicism. People like James Matthew Wilson, Joshua Wren, that are young Catholic intellectuals whose whole identity, is Catholic. You see people that are, creating these magazines like Dappled Things, that are creating fora, for them. Now, what makes a Catholic writer? Well, I would say, if you think of the Catholic worldview, it starts in original sin, which is to say, we have a kind of innate fallibility in us, an inability through our own power to perfect ourselves. So in original sin, we long for redemption, but we require a grace. And I think, that's that we are also people that have a long historical vision. Catholics look back, not only to original sin, which perhaps all Christians do, but really from Christ and the time of the Caesars up through today as an unbroken historical continuity. That was especially true in my generation, where we still learned Latin. I, as a poor kid in Southwest LA, I learned Latin. I read the Aeneid, Catullus, Horace, as well as the Book of Ruth and things like this from the Vulgate in Latin. I was part of a conversation that went all the way back to the time of Christ and the Caesars. That is very different for Protestants. I don't think Protestants have that ancient memory. Catholics also have a sacramental sense of the world. I mean, if you ask me what makes all of my poems Catholic, and I didn't intend this, this was pointed out by a critic. I was just reading a review of my first book, and I said, that never occurred to me, but this guy is right, is that Catholics believe that we simultaneously exist in time and eternity. There's a material world and a spiritual world that are contingent, and that our existence, starting with our worship, is full of sacraments, sacramental signs, outward signs that reflect an inward turn of grace. And so you look at the way Catholics use symbols, it's just very different, from the way that an atheist would. To them, it's a material object. To Catholics, it is a metaphysical relationship between this world and the next. And so we finally, I think, have, a different view of time. We are moving in time from creation and the fall through our historical redemption, through the sacrifice of Jesus, uh, towards eternity. And the things that we do in this life have consequences. So I think that's the joy of being a Catholic. No matter what I do, it has a metaphysical context. And that gives me the incentive to try, and I'm terribly, at this, I'm a failure at this, to try to perfect myself in some ways, to constantly work, in a sense, to be worthy of the faith, of the existence that I've been given, the soul that I've been given. So that's how I would say a Catholic writer. You'll see one or more or all of those things in a Catholic writer. They don't have to be talking about the Virgin Mary or the crucifixion or anything else, but that is the worldview that will permeate their work.
Another participant has asked, what have you found to be a good way to create space for community and connection on a smaller scale in our towns, our churches, and our universities?
Well, I think you do it differently when you're young than when you do it when I'm old. What I do now is I am constantly, when I was made Poet Laureate of California, I said as my project is I'm just going to go to all 58 counties of California. Now, what you have to understand is that Los Angeles County has 10 million people. Alpine County, has 1,300 people. Most of the counties of California are small, isolated, and rural. A lot of them are up in the mountains. And so I chose, in the public office of laureate, to go to places that poets don't go to, that famous poets don't go to, and I would go to them for free. Everywhere I went, I'd say, okay, I'm going to read in Alpine, but I want you to find some local poets to read with me. There is no town in the United States too small that it doesn't have some poets, or get some musicians. So everywhere I went, it became a celebration of the local community for which I was the catalyst. I've tried to do this for Catholic and for Christian organizations too. I invest a lot of my time going to places so that I can give the other people the excuse, the ability to gather together. And my hope is that in the process, they meet each other and they continue these things. And I'm always happy when people say, well, gee, when you came to this place, it was the first poetry reading we've ever had here. But now we liked it so much, we're now doing it every month. And so so what you do it is by action. Now, if you're younger, you just find some people and you create things. You create a writer's group. I just got a letter yesterday from a woman I told to do this. And she wrote me a letter. It was months later. And she said how excited she was. She's got like 5 people and they now have a writer's group. And so that's what you do. You take what you have at hand and you make a dwelling. You think of, I will rise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. Now, what the hell are clay and wattles? Clay and wattles are the reeds and sticks that are on this island and the mud. Yeats is building himself a cabin, which he looks on as paradise, out of the materials at hand. We need to build our culture with the materials that we have at hand. And there's everywhere. And once you start, people will help you.
Wonderful. A student asks, in a culture of constant communication and stimulation, we, especially students, feel pressure to produce and create something original. How would you recommend we better internalize our first reactions and ideas to nurture a healthy love for language and expression that may overflow fruitfully?
Unplug yourself. The most important thing you can do if you want to be an artist is to create, what was the thing that Get Smart had? The cone of silence. You've got to make a space of silence around you, of solitude. Uh, there's a story that Thomas Merton recounts where, this young Trappist, he's come to the monastery and he goes to his confessor and he goes, I'm going crazy. I'm hearing voices, it's so weird. I try to be alone, but all these voices are talking to me. And the confessor says, good, you are finally hearing your own soul speak. So you've got to, whoever this student is, but all the other students, you've got to, you want to be busy in the world, be productive in the world, but also make a time in the day, a space in your life where other things can happen. If you want other things to happen, create the space where that's possible. And in that space, read, reflect, listen. When I was chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, I honestly, God help me, I was working 7 days a week. I would go in the morning, I would have, night, evening engagements where I had to give speeches or attend receptions. It was entirely public life. That's what it took to save the National Endowment for the Arts, which was when I came into it, was a faltering institution. But what I did is for my vacation each year, and God bless my wife for understanding this, is I went off to, an almost deserted island, off Washington coast in the San Juan Islands, an island called Waldron Island, which in the height of the summer has 100 people on it. No shops, no electricity, no phones, no anything. I had a little shack. I had an outhouse, and I had the sea and the woods, and I was alone. And to go from totally public life to this was very hard. The loneliness was at times extremely difficult. I knew this wonderful composer, Morton Lordson, who was on the other end of the island, and at night I would walk several miles and see him. But most of my existence was solitary and silent. I might not see another person all day long. And out of that, my poetry came. So think of the muse as your girlfriend or boyfriend or beloved. If when the muse comes, you go, hey, I'm busy, I'm listening to other thing else, come back later, she is going to stop visiting you. You should be ready. So when the muse arrives, you say, I've been waiting for you. How great to see you. Let's talk. Let's make something wonderful together. So you have to do that. And I think it's very hard for the young because they have been completely enwrapped in this electronic culture, since early adolescence. But you have to break that.
Another student asks, one of the speakers earlier spoke in praise of, quote, reading which scandalizes, offends you, gives you something problematic to think through and wrestle with. How does poetry help us see our times as they really are and to face them with justice and compassion?
Well, poetry is not one thing. Poetry is a language in which anything can be said if the poet has skill. So poetry is simply a medium. And so the same way how can you do that with photography? I said, well, go to the kinds of photographs that present this. And poetry is full, from the very beginning of, in a sense, trying to bring justice into the human condition. There's so many, writers that write about this, where does one begin? I don't see what else Dante is about, if not for that. And Dante understands, as Catholics understand, if you want to morally reform the world, you begin with yourself. You begin by recognizing your own shortcomings, but there's social justice is one of the great themes of poetry, during its time. You want to, read Dudley Randall's Ballad of Birmingham, read, Gwendolyn Brooks. I mean, those are two authors I was actually talking to somebody about earlier today. The Ballad of Birmingham, which is about the bombing of the Birmingham church, is a wonderful poem. And the beauty, to go back to one of your earlier questions, this is a poem that anybody can understand. You don't need even a high school degree. A fourth grader can understand this poem. So I think if you're interested in that now, but I want to make one other thing. If you believe that poetry can only exist if it's telling you what to do in political and moral terms, you don't understand poetry. Because what that's saying is that I want to write poetry with only this part of the human being, where poetry, the interesting thing is that art, art communicates all kinds of things that the artist doesn't intend, because art is a representation of reality. And if I say the same poem to 5 different people, if I say the same good poem to 5 different people, you're going to get 5 different interpretations, 5 different reactions, because this person will see this thing that they need. This person will see that thing that they need. And that's great. That's the beauty of art, that you can go and you can find the spiritual thing, the emotional thing that you need at that moment.
So the last question is, what, other than yourself, what poets would you recommend our audience pick up and read tomorrow?
Well, if we're talking about throughout all time, and there's so many, a couple of poets. My favorite poet is W.H. Auden. I began reading W.H. Auden in high school, and I still read him. And I think he's a poet. Interestingly, he's a Christian poet. He's also gay. He was also went through a Marxist phase, a Freudian phase, a Kierkegaardian phase. He's compendiously intelligent and intellectual, but the poems are beautiful. They're funny. There's something of everything. Another poet I love, and I read him as a child, in school as an adolescent, and I didn't like him at all as an adolescent. But I've come to think of as one of the wisest poets who ever wrote is William Wordsworth. Wordsworth is this poet who, to a certain degree, I think articulates what our right stance versus nature versus creation is. And for that, to me, he's extremely valuable. Emily Dickinson is a poet you'll never get tired of. I mean, they're short poems. You can just almost open up her book at random, read 2 or 3 poems. I think is wonderful. Every Catholic should study Dante. We've mentioned him a couple of times, but he's the greatest poet of the Western tradition, the greatest poet of the Catholic tradition. And for living poets, my favorite living American poet is a woman named Kay Ryan. Kay Ryan. I have the honor, the distinction of having been the first person to ever write a little essay about her. She was unknown, and I happened to come across her work. She's now, everybody agrees with, she's the new Emily Dickinson. But Kay Ryan writes these very short, kind of slightly metaphysical poems, and she's a genius. She's a genius at the level of Dickinson. And she's still alive. She lives in Marin County. She was a teacher of what would you call it? Remedial English at a community college for most of her career. But then she became poet laureate. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She won a MacArthur, and she's now among the immortals. Thank goodness. But I'd recommend Kay Ryan.
Wonderful. Well, our time is at an end. Thank you so much for your generosity, for sharing your art with us, for giving us the advice that you've given our students, our audience, our community here. We agree with you entirely on your prescription that the path forward is to build and strengthen our own communities, build a civilization of love our neighbor. That's the pathway to healing going forward. And please don't be a stranger to the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, the University of Notre Dame. We're so grateful.
Well, and I was about to say, Auden has a wonderful, very famous poem, September 1st, 1939. It goes, "No one exists alone." And, and and he articulated the city of God too. So I want to thank everyone who's responsible for today. Thank you for making me part of this community. It is a great honor. I hope I haven't been a terrible bore. And God bless us, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank everyone who has participated in this conference. I can think of no better way to have concluded our conference this evening than in reflecting on the beauty that connects us all wherever we may be. So we have come to the end of our time together. Before we go, I'd like to thank a few people for making this entire conference possible. First, of course, to our many wonderful guests, speakers, and moderators who gave us this opportunity for reflection. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. To our wonderful friends and benefactors whose support makes all of our work possible, particularly Tony and Christy DeNicola, as well as the Alfred E. Smith Memorial Foundation for their generous support of this important conference in particular. None of this week's conversations would have been possible without all of the great people working behind the scenes, Eric, Richard, Nick, Amy, Lynn, and all the amazing professionals at ND Studios. They've worked incredibly hard to keep this week's conference running so smoothly, and we are indebted to them for their help. And lastly, as every year, I'd like to thank my extraordinary staff. I've told you all in the past that they are the staff that would ruin every other staff for you, that they've set the standard for staffs. And every single year, they just keep raising the bar and exceeding it. These are extraordinary people. Everything good about the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture is owed to them. They are amazing folks. Tracy Westlake, Hannah Brown, Petra Farrell, Pete Labsey, Laura Gonziorek, Father John Paul Kimes, and then two of our colleagues in particular, Ken Hellenius, who is our communication specialist, but also has extraordinary technical expertise and brings that generously to bear as to make this event possible. And then finally, last but not least, the sine qua non of the fall conference, the winter conference, the MVP of this event, as always, is the indefatigable, the extraordinary Margaret Cabanis. And if we were in a room of 700 people, as we normally are at this point, when we have the blessing to be together in person, she would deserve and would receive a standing ovation. Thank you all so much for coming. Please join us at the DeNicola Center again soon. God willing, we'll be able to see each other in person when on the other side of this pandemic. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of one another. God bless you all, and good night.